Good morning. Okay. Today we will be discussing a very important topic that is on meningitis. Uh, what is meningitis? As you know that when you look at the anatomical structure, the brain and spinal cord are covered by three connective tissues. Okay, and these are collectively known as the meninges. So, and these form the structure which you call as the blood-brain barrier. So you have the pia mater, which is very close to the central nervous system. You have the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. So this is just the, I don't know if you are able to see, this is the structure of the central nervous system. And the meninges are the ones which you have the CSF or the cerebrospinal fluid. So these are the ones, the covering which actually contains the CSF. Now, coming to the definition of meningitis, how will you define meningitis? Is basically an inflammatory process of the leptomeninges and the CSF. So, very severe, it may become encephalitis, wherein the brain also becomes affected. So, inflammation of the brain basically refers, we call it as encephalitis. But meningitis is just the inflammatory process which involves the meninges and the CSF. Now, causes of meningitis, there are a lot of causes of meningitis, as you would have known by through all these classes which you have taken, that the etiology can be either because of bacterial infections, it can be because of viral infections, or it can be because of fungal infections, or sometimes it can be because as a part of a response of the inflammatory disease such as SLE, or maybe because of cancer, or maybe because of trauma to the head or spine. So there are a lot of causes of meningitis. Now, the classification of meningitis, you can classify it because when you have a case of meningitis which presents to you in the OPD, you have to be very clear about what is the type of meningitis. So, the meningitis, you can classify it as acute pyogenic, which basically means when you talk about acute pyogenic, they are usually bacterial meningitis because the infection will have it will be a very acute, very short duration, and when you look at the CSF, there'll be a lot of inflammatory cells, that is your WBC's neutrophils. Then you have the aseptic viral meningitis. This is more classically seen in case of viral infections. Then you can have chronic bacterial infection, which is chronic meningitis. This is more typically seen in case of tuberculosis. However, in the case of cryptococcal meningitis, this is also another fungal infection where you can have a chronic type of meningitis. So if you have a case of meningitis, your classification will usually be acute meningitis, chronic meningitis, or aseptic meningitis. If you are very clear about the presentation, this is how you will classify meningitis. Because once you talk about chronic chronic meningitis, the idea comes that if it's chronic, it will always be because of tuberculosis or because of cryptococcuses. Sometimes you might have focal suppurative infections, such in the case of brain abscesses, or sometimes subdural extradural empyema. So these are some of the other causes of meningitis. Now, coming to the etiological agents of bacterial meningitis, or what we call as pyogenic meningitis, most of the time you will see that the most common cause of the acute pyogenic meningitis is Streptococcus pneumonia, or what we call as pneumococcal meningitis. Then we have meningococcal, that is Neisseria meningitidis, which contributes to 14% of the acute or pyogenic meningitis. We have Haemophilus influenzae, we have Staphylococcus aureus, and then we can also have Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But this is not a pyogenic, not acute type of meningitis. It is a meningitis which is of chronic type. Now, what are the predisposing factors which render a person susceptible to the infection? As we know that first thing, for any pathogen to enter in such a sterile site, there has to be colonization. So most of the time when you talk about these respiratory pathogens, pneumococcus or Haemophilus, they have to colonize the respiratory pathogens, respiratory tract. And then subsequently, This will be followed by mucosal invasion of the nasopharynx. Sometimes, because of trauma, there can be direct extension because of the trauma where the cribriform plate is involved and it gets fractured. So the pathogens can directly enter into the central nervous system. Or sometimes it can be because as a form of an outcome of a systemic bacteremia, where the bacteria multiplies in the heart or it multiplies in the blood. So it is able to evade the immune response. It penetrates the blood-brain barrier and then it goes to the central nervous system. Then, of course, we have other predisposing conditions like a person who's having HIV infection, a person who's having asplenia. Then you can have a person who has complement deficiencies, or sometimes a person because of some form of chemotherapy where they have to take a lot of steroids. So those are some of the other predisposing factors. And then we can also have some forms where you have immunodeficiencies. Okay, so this is again one of the causes where, particularly especially in children and neonates, where the immune system is not very robust, and you can have your immunoglobulins also are not very strong. So in those kind of age groups, you can also have meningitis because of lack of immunity. Then crowding and poverty. This is more relevant when you talk about those infections, especially in the case of Neisseria meningitidis, where it has been seen that outbreak of meningococcal meningitis can occur because of overcrowding or poverty, because when these can also occur as epidemics or sporadic episodes of infection because of overcrowding. Now, there are certain specific conditions which are associated with meningitis. Like in this here, you can see when there's a complement deficiency of C5 and C8, then the person becomes more prone to have recurrent meningococcal meningitis. And a person who has ventricular peritoneal shunts, these are patients who have hydrocephalus. So when you have a shunt, then they become more susceptible to infections with coagulase negative staphylococcus and corynebacterium. These per se do not actually cause infection in a normal person with robust immunity, but in patients who have these type of interventions where you have the shunts there, then they can predispose to meningitis. Then again, pneumococcal meningitis, this can occur due to trauma. If there's a fracture in the cribriform plate or paraneal sinuses, so direct penetration of the pathogen directly to the brain can also cause. Then in case of splenic dysfunction, a person has got sickle cell anemia or there's no spleen, we have to remove the spleen because of some other conditions, then they can again predispose to pneumococcal or Haemophilus influenza type B. Then a person who has T-cell deficiency, then you can have cryptococcal or Listeria monocytogenes. Then patients who have open neural tube defects, then they predispose to Staphylococcus and even gram-negative bacteria. Then again, similarly here with head trauma, or if there's neurosurgical interventions or procedures which has been performed on a person, they can also have infection by Staphylococcus. So if you look at this, there are many causes, many predisposing factors of how a person can acquire meningitis. And if you look at the agents, you can see that there are a range of agents which can cause meningitis. Now, the commonest meningitis, this is a classification to show you that depending on specific certain age groups, this is a table which shows you that, depending on certain age groups, there are certain agents which are very, very common to certain age groups. Like if a child is within 1 month of age, most common agent which we have isolated or which we have seen to cause meningitis is Streptococcus agalactiae, E. coli, Listeria monocytogenes. Sometimes, though very rare, Klebsiella pneumonia, Enterococcus species. Now, this is the reason why you see when suppose you have a mother who's a carrier of Streptococcus agalactiae, and then when she delivers a child, okay, and if she delivers a child by normal vaginal delivery, then the chance that the child or the neonate acquiring the infection becomes very high, because as you know that neonate, the immune system is also very immature. So they can easily acquire the infection and then can land up with meningitis caused by these agents, that is Streptococcus agalactiae, because it can colonize the birth canal of the mother. Similarly with Escherichia coli or Listeria monocytogenes. Then subsequently 1 to 3 months, again you can have the same agents. Added to that, you can also have Haemophilus influenza, Streptococcus pneumonia, and Neisseria meningitis. However, as a child grows 3 months to over 15 years, the agents that is which are more commonly isolated from these from the cases of meningitis are usually because of Haemophilus influenza type B, Neisseria meningitis, and Streptococcus pneumonia. So in adults, if you look here, you can see that majority of the causes of meningitis is because of Streptococcus pneumoniae. Then we have Neisseria meningitis, Haemophilus influenza, gram-negative bacilli, Listeria, Streptococcus, and Staphylococcus. So this is in the order of the prevalence of the meningitis pertaining to the type of agents which can cause meningitis. Now, viral meningitis, or what we call as aseptic meningitis. So this is basically a syndrome which you can define as a syndrome characterized by acute onset of meningeal symptoms, fever, and cerebrospinal fluid pleocytosis with bacteriologically sterile cultures. So if you have a person who has meningitis, you're suspecting him or her to be having meningitis, but if you send a culture, it will be sterile. So you have to think of bacterial agents where the entity will become aseptic meningitis. So there are some ways of classifying the type of viral meningitis, but predominantly when you talk about aseptic meningitis, most cases are caused by a viral agent. Now, the etiological viral agents which causes aseptic meningitis, you can have enteroviruses, that is Coxsackie and echoviruses, which are the most common agents causing aseptic meningitis. You can have adenovirus, you can have arbovirus, measles, HSV, and then you can have varicella zoster virus, which can cause meningitis. So some of these agents, as you have been taught, that some of these agents reservoirs might be humans, but in some you might have reservoirs where the birds or rodents can be the reservoirs, natural reservoirs for these viral infections. So the mode of transmission usually is primarily person to person, or sometimes you might have arthropods are involved in the form of meningitis. But most of the time, when you talk about aseptic meningitis, some of them do present with encephalitis. Now, encephalitis, as you know, is basically inflammation of the brain. So when you talk about encephalitis, this is a totally different entity as from meningitis. Like in the case of Japanese encephalitis, you do not say that the person is having meningitis, but you will say Japanese encephalitis because it also involves the brain. So these are some of the clear points you have to differentiate between meningitis and encephalitis. Again, some of the viral agents can clearly cause meningitis, some of them will cause encephalitis. So incubation period, again, if you look at this point here, you can see that the incubation period might be variable. It can range between 3 to 6 days for enterovirus, which is a very short incubation period, or it can be very long, as in the case of arboviruses. That is particularly, let's take the example of Japanese encephalitis, where you can have the incubation period ranging from 2 to 15 days. The problem here, again, there's no specific treatment available for most of the aseptic meningitis caused by the viral agents, and most time you will see that the patients recover completely on their own. Though sometimes you might have some form of neurological sequelae which can occur, especially when you talk about cases of Japanese encephalitis, where a person who has completely recovered, but there will be some form of neurological sequelae as an outcome because of the infection. Now, these are some of the symptoms of of the meningitis. As you know that a person can present with vomiting, very high fever, headache, neck stiffness is one of the classical signs where we try to elicit when the person is having meningitis, and then dislike of bright lights, drowsiness, lethargy, joint pains, or sometimes a person can have seizures. Not all of these symptoms will appear at the same time, so you have to elicit all these signs and symptoms. But what you also have to remember that though we keep saying that these are the classical signs of meningitis in children and in neonates particularly and elderly, sometimes they might present very atypically. Like in neonates, a baby will not have failure to thrive, they will not feed, they will have fever. So those are some of the signs and symptoms which you have to consider when you talk about meningitis in these particular age groups. This is a picture showing you that this is a slide showing the hemorrhagic manifestation of the rashes, which you commonly seen in case of meningococcal meningitis. Sometimes a person who is infected with who's having meningitis because of meningococcal meningitis, they can present you with this form of rash. So the rash becomes more hemorrhagic. You can have ecchymosis, which is again very characteristically seen in case of meningococcal meningitis. So if you have a case of meningitis, you have to look at all the signs and symptoms, the presentation of how they present, what are the classical signs and symptoms of how you can actually reach to a presumptive diagnosis. Now coming to the diagnosis of meningitis. Now meningitis, as you know, is basically inflammation of the meninges. So to diagnose meningitis, though we talk about neck stiffness, we talk about lethargy, we talk about, you talk about seizures, there are many other causes, non-infectious, other causes of how a person can present with those kinds of signs and symptoms. So to actually clinch a diagnosis of meningitis, you have to do a TAP, that is a CSF TAP, or lumbar puncture, where you have to collect the CSF. And then once you have collected the CSF, then you can appropriately send a sample to the lab, and then we can reach to some diagnosis, or we are able to diagnose or observe the infectious agent in the clinical sample. So basically here when we talk about in lumbar puncture, we know that we have to take a CSF fluid. So where do you have to take the CSF fluid? It's usually between the third and the fourth lumbar vertebra in the lower spine. So this you have to ensure that the person is actually very cooperative. Otherwise, you will not be able to collect the CSF. There are certain precautions you have to take before doing a lumbar puncture, because as you know that the person is having meningitis, so there will be a lot of intracranial pressure in the CSF. So you have to send the person for ophthalmology investigation, so that you will see that there's no pressure is actually maintained. So here is what we actually do in the lab. Once it comes to the lab, what we do with the CSF, we look for the parameters, we look for the cell count, and then we look for the protein, then we look for the glucose, because when you talk about acute, chronic, or even aseptic meningitis, these parameters will actually differ. So if you look at the biochemical parameters, or even if you look at the microbiological parameters of CSF in case of meningitis, some of them will be very, very clear cut. Okay, so most of the time we look for the presence of WBCs, neutrophils. If they are there, if a lot of neutrophils are there, this is where you can say that the CSF is actually the person is having pyogenic meningitis. If we're having more of lymphocytes, these are more often you see in case of chronic type of meningitis, or even in case of aseptic meningitis. Now, if you remember, I've already mentioned that sometimes when you talk about meningitis, it's not that because of direct penetration, but sometimes it can occur because of bacteremia, wherein the bacteria multiplies in the bloodstream, and then it goes to the central nervous system because it is able to evade the blood-brain barrier. So in those kind of cases, simultaneously you also have to send a blood culture. This is more pertinent when you talk about agents like Haemophilus, or in case of Neisseria, or in case of Streptococcus pneumoniae, because most of the time you will see that a person is having bacteremia caused by these agents and they can land up with meningitis. So very often when you talk about diagnosis of meningitis, simultaneously you also have to send a blood culture, and it will always, most of the time you will see that blood cultures are often positive. And though the CSF, we are not able to diagnose or able to visualize the causative agent in the CSF. And it has been seen here that at least one half of patients with bacterial meningitis have a positive blood culture, with the lowest yield being obtained with meningococcus. Okay, so these are some instances. You always have to remember that when you have to diagnose meningitis, though you have taken CSF, please make sure that you also send a blood culture. Now, CSF analysis, this is indicated for all patients with meningitis, unless the procedure is contraindicated. If a person is having very high intracranial pressure, then you cannot go for lumbar puncture. Otherwise, what will happen is, because of increased intracranial pressure, there might be herniation, and then the person will end up with a lot of complications. So this is the reason why we always send for ophthal examination, so that they can see whether the pressure is actually okay or not before you even attempt to do lumbar puncture. So here, as you can see in this next point, where there are certain features which will suggest that a person is having bacterial meningitis. You will see that glucose concentration will be very less, but the protein concentration will be very, very high, and your neutrophil or the WBC count will be very, very high. So these are some of the features which will tell you that the cause of the meningitis is because of bacterial meningitis or because of aseptic meningitis. And most of the time when you talk about examination of CSF, we can easily do a gram stain. Gram stain is a very good method where you can actually see the causative agent when you talk, especially when you're talking about bacterial pyogenic meningitis. I'm not talking about tuberculosis here, because tuberculosis sometimes it becomes very difficult, and sometimes because of postbacillary, very less number of bacteria which can actually goes to the CSF. So you sometimes, in case of tuberculous meningitis, you might not be able to visualize the acid-fast bacilli if you do a Zeal-Nielsen stain. But a gram stain is more relevant when you talk about causes of meningitis pertaining to Streptococcus pneumoniae, Haemophilus, or meningococcal meningitis. So it has been observed that gram stain is positive in up to 10% of patients with negative CSF cultures, and up to 80% of those with positive cultures. So a gram stain is a very simple test. You can easily diagnose cases of meningitis by just doing this very, very simple test. So gram stain positivity, the positivity of doing gram stain in diagnosing meningitis has been reported as much as more than 60%, and when you do culture, then the sensitivity goes up to more than 80%. Now the policies of doing gram stain, again lies, a person has to be very well versed with the gram stain to see the bacteria, because in meningitis, when you talk about pyogenic meningitis, most of the time you will have a lot of inflammatory cells. So to actually visualize the agents in the inflammatory cells, because the size of the bacteria and the size of the neutrophils are very different. The bacteria is very small, but the neutrophils are very huge. So if you have to search for the bacteria in the midst of all the inflammatory cells, sometimes it might not be, you might not be able to visualize them. Again, with culture positivity, you have to remember that everything depends on how you have stored the sample. This you have to remember when you're collecting samples, samples for meningitis. Please do not keep it in the refrigerator. You can keep it in the room temperature. That is even better. You can keep it in the room temperature, but you should never ever refrigerate the CSF sample if you're going for bacterial cultures. Of course, if you're talking about viral, you're going to talk about viral isolation. That is a totally different aspect. You have to keep it in the cold. But if you're going to isolate the bacteria for meningitis, please never ever store the sample in the refrigerator. So this is again one precaution you have to ensure. Otherwise, if you keep it in the refrigerator, the bacteria will die and then the culture will become negative in spite of you observing the bacteria in the gram stain. Now, because now again with gram stain, I've told you that the sensitivity is only about 60%. Now culture positivity again will depend how you have stored the sample. So and again with culture, it might take more than 24 hours. So for 24 hours, sometimes you might not have the time to wait before initiation of therapy. So there are other modalities where you can rapidly diagnose cases of meningitis. So here is where we have the latex agglutination test. These are rapid tests where we directly look for the antigen in the CSF. So these are very rapid tests. You can easily diagnose or you can easily identify what is the cause of meningitis, because if you look at the agents which cause meningitis are not gram positive. They can have a plethora of gram negative as well as gram positive. So your management of cases of meningitis will be different, because if you're gram positive, your antibiotics which you're going to give will be totally different. If it's a gram negative, again your antibiotics which you're going to use for treatment will be different. So for those kind of cases, if you have the facility where you can do latex agglutination, this is very good. It's very rapid and it's very specific. Here what you can do is you can just directly take the CSF sample and just add a drop of the antiserum of Streptococcus pneumoniae. This comes as a kit. So you have all these the antiserum pertaining to all these to all these bacteria. You just add a drop of the antibodies which are coated with the specific bacteria, and then you can see the agglutination. So this is a very rapid test. It's very specific. So if these modalities are there, you can easily use these tests for rapid diagnosis of meningitis. Now PCR comes into play, where you can directly detect the bacterial DNA. This might not be a very good modality if you're going to diagnose immediately, because PCR takes some time. It takes some time for you to actually diagnose the bacterial agents. So as of now, if you have to diagnose cases of meningitis, if you have if you have to have the antigens, that is the latex agglutination kit, then that will be much more useful. But you can still rely on gram stain and culture for definitive diagnosis. So these are some of the typical findings of the CSF findings in case of meningitis. You will see in case of bacterial meningitis, there will be a lot of neutrophils, okay? And then you will have that the glucose level will be less, and you will have the proteins will be very, very high. In case of viral meningitis, you will see that the CSF glucose will be almost normal, and then you will not be able to see the presence of neutrophils. What you will be able to observe in the case of when you talk about the cell morphology in CSF is you will see more of lymphocytes. So if you're seeing more of lymphocytes, you should think that the causative agent is more of a chronic type of meningitis, but either because of your tuberculosis or because of viral agents. So this is a feature here. You can see this picture here. You can see these pink structures which you're seeing. They are all the neutrophils which you observe if you can see there's one picture here where you can see those pink cells. Those are actually the Neisseria meningitidis. Neisseria meningitidis, as you know, they are gram-negative diplococci. So they are gram-negative diplococci, and most of them you will see them, they should be intracellular. So this is a typical morphology of Neisseria meningitis. They will be diplococci, gram-negative, and will be intracellular. So this is a picture which we have always observed in case of Neisseria meningitidis. This is the structure of a normal brain. You can see in case of tuberculosis, you will see there'll be lot of the exudate. I think you have been told that in case of tuberculosis, you will have a clot formation. If you leave the CSF lying for some time undisturbed, you will see a form of a clot formation, cobweb formation in the CSF. So these are some of the features which you can observe in case of tuberculous meningitis, as it is in case of tuberculous meningitis, the basal part of the brain is the one which usually gets affected. So if you do a post-mortem examination of the brain, this is what you will see. You will see a lot of exudates in the basal part of the brain. Fortunately, there are some vaccines pertaining to some of the agents which cause meningitis. We know that this is pertaining to the bacterial agents. We have vaccines which have been directed against Haemophilus influenza type B. Then we have vaccines against Neisseria meningitidis and Streptococcus pneumoniae. So these are some of the vaccines which I think some of them are included in your expanded immunization program, especially when you talk about Haemophilus influenza B, type B. So these are usually given to children, and it has been included in your immunization schedule. Then we also have vaccines against Streptococcus pneumoniae and again against Neisseria meningitidis. Now, please remember that meningitis is a medical emergency, so you have to immediately diagnose and treat the patient. You cannot leave the patient till you have a specific diagnosis. Sometimes you might have to go for empirical therapy, and then you change your antibiotic modality depending on what is the agent of the which causes the meningitis, because it has been observed that the mortality rate of untreated bacterial meningitis approaches 100% even with optimal therapy. And there's also a chance of a high failure rate, especially if you have agents which shows resistance, so then it becomes a big problem. So empiric treatment should be begun as soon as the diagnosis is suspected using any of the, you have empirical treatment where you have to initiate immediately as soon as you suspect a case of meningitis, and then you can change your antibiotics depending on what is the causative agent. So this is very important for you to remember, that if you have a case of meningitis, you have to empirically start immediately, you have to start treating the patients. Please do not wait till you get your laboratory confirmation of what is the agent. You have to start on empirical therapy, and then you can change the antibiotics depending on what is the causative agent. So here again you have to remember that because it involves the central nervous systems, you cannot use bacteriostatic agents. Okay, you always have to use bactericidal agents. So maybe in pharmacology you will be knowing whether the bacteriostatic, bactericidal agents, but please remember bacteriostatic agents are not actually the antibiotics you should use in case of meningitis. We have a very old drug which we call as chloramphenicol. This is a very good drug. In fact, we have observed here that because this is a drug which has been initially used, it has been used empirically for most infections, and resistance has developed. But in the past few years, we have observed that chloramphenicol has come up, and then we have observed that it has become sensitive to most of the bacterial agents. So this is again a very good drug. It's bactericidal, and easily it can penetrate the blood-brain barrier. if you're going to treat some of the agents of causes of meningitis. But you have to be cautious here, because again, chloramphenicol has got a lot of adverse effect, especially if you're going to use chloramphenicol in children. Then you have to be very, very careful. However, the best choice here, what we have now, is for empiric treatment of meningitis. We always use the third generation cephalosporins. We have ceftriaxone, we have cefotaxime. These are some of the very good drugs, the third generation cephalosporins, which have got very good blood penetration of the blood-brain barrier, and they are again bactericidal. So these are some of the drugs which we often use in case of empiric treatment of meningitis. Now, brain abscess. Brain abscess can again occur because of complication of bacterial meningitis, or it can be because, as I've told you, it can be because of bacteremia, which occur because of endocarditis. Or sometimes a person has pneumonia, and the bacteria multiplies in the bloodstream, and it goes to the central nervous system, or maybe it might be because of other causes of sepsis. So this is what leads to brain abscess. So brain abscess per se, it can present to you as a space occupying lesion, where a person might not actually present to you with the classical signs and symptoms of meningitis, but they can present to you with signs of space occupying lesion. They may have some loss in some functions, other motor functions. So here in these kind of cases, you have to take the help of not only the lab parameters. You also have to take off radiological investigations, where you have to identify the lesion, where it occupies, in what part of the central nervous system, what part of the brain it has involved. So this is a picture. You can see this is a picture showing the abscess involving the cortex. You can see there's a brain, the abscess here, where you can see that you can see the abscess fully involving the cortex. So this can cause some form of motor neurological deficit in the person if there's a form of a brain abscess. So this is all about meningitis. Okay, please remember, this is a very important topic. You please read up, because as you know, that is, let's not talk only about exam point of view, but you will definitely come across cases of meningitis. It's not a totally uncommon clinical presentation or common case, because you will get cases of meningitis very often. So please be very clear about the etiological agents, how you will proceed for diagnosis, and what are the precautions you will take if you have to diagnose a case of meningitis. Just go through your textbook, just read about meningitis, because it's a very important topic. Okay, it's not only important in microbiology, because you will come across these cases in medicine. You will come across cases of meningitis. When you go to pediatrics, you will come across cases of meningitis. So you have to be very clear of how to diagnose cases of meningitis. At least you should be able to identify a person is having meningitis at least. And identify whether the person is having meningitis or encephalitis, and at least know what are the agents which can cause meningitis, because unless you know what are the agents, then you will not be able to send the relevant investigations. I hope it's clear. Okay, thank you. Take care.
Take care.